turn out. Welcome to those of you who are regulars and to some new faces in the room. Wonderful to see you here. Please, if you haven't done so already, let me have your name and email address so that we can add you to the list and send you regular information about what we're doing. I'm very pleased this evening to welcome two old friends. I'm not sure when I first met Stanley and Elizabeth, but we've known each other for a number of years now. And I've learned over coffee that they have been working for more than 20 years now at Holy Rood House down near Thirsk. They've left some information over here for you to look at afterwards. As it says on the banner, Holy Rood is a centre for health and pastoral care. And for those of us in the North East, is a marvellous resource for people needing help in a variety of different ways, from spiritual direction through to counselling or just a space to be and to find some healing and opportunity to pray. Doubtless they'll be telling you more about that this evening, but their theme for the seminar is spirituality and trauma. They're going to share the evening, and I think Stanley is going to start. Is that correct?
Start very briefly, yes.
Stanley, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Chris was asking us how long we'd actually worked together. Well, that's, I think, 45 years. And we're still together, so that's a great thing. We've worked together on this. And prior to doing this work, we were parish priests in an urban priority area in Leeds, so we had that kind of experience. But we decided that although we worked together, it would be much more sensible if one of us, and it's going to be Elizabeth, took the main part of the meeting tonight. That's what we're going to do. And we're looking forward afterwards to some real theological conversation about trauma and other things, which is about theology that we're interested in. So Elizabeth is going to lead us.
Yep, okay, thanks very much. Well, first of all, we thought it would be an idea to just put the spirituality and trauma into a context that doesn't make it ethereal stuff, because it's, as you will see as we go through the seminar, it's deeply embodied stuff. Everything comes into the body. So I just thought, just for a few moments, if each of us just think about our own lives and think about the scars we have on our bodies. Just think, I should imagine probably everybody has got at least one scar on your body. I have several on mine. Just try and think of the scars that are on your body just for a moment. Shut your eyes and just try and sort of go through head to toe. And then just to reflect, what caused the scars? What was it that produced the scar? What kind of trauma to the body was that? And what repercussions may it have had for my understanding of relationship, possibilities of love or lack of love, or the opposite to love? Where are the links with breakdown of trust? Where's the suddenness, the unexpected? What's going on when something happens? Just reflect on that just for a minute. Now, obviously there are some of us will have scars in places we wouldn't want to talk about. And indeed, as we know, and as in the news a lot at the moment, there are many women and girls across the world who have horrific scars from dreadful mutilations. And we know that there it is. And the trauma of that kind of stuff is around. But many of us have also had dreadful things. I've had, if I use just a simple thing that I can just talk about, for example, I've got a scar on one of my knees where I fell over when I was a little girl when I was 7. I remember it. but my mother was there, who loved me, looked after me. So she picked me up, kissed it better, tried to make it better, helped me home, you know, we got home, bandaged up and so on. So when I see the scar, there's a mixture of memories, but my main memory is that my mother looked after me. That was a good memory. So that scar gave me a good memory. I want us to make a connection with our scarring with the idea of the scarred Christ or Christa. Many of the women who come to Holy Rood who explore their own spirituality like to refer to the ideas of the Christa, to try and comprehend and resonate with a Christ that resonates with them. The scarred Christa. This photo actually is the, as you face it, the arm on the left, you might be able to just notice, is very scarred. You can't quite tell very well. And here is an accompanier, someone befriending, an arm that isn't scarred holding the hand of somebody who's slashed all around her arm. And I remember a woman coming to Holy Rood House some years ago now who was so covered in scars that she couldn't cover it up. But my experience is that at Holy Rood people feel safe enough not to have to keep covering it all up, which is very important. But this woman had them round here, up here, right across her legs and across her midriff and so on. Now, so I have to ask myself, what is spirituality in trauma? And as a Christian, as a priest myself, I have to ask, how do I meet Christ, or the Christa, or however we understand Christ to be? Where do I meet that Christ? How do I meet? Who is this young woman, or lad? Loads of lads now. But who is this young woman coming across the threshold, covered in these scars? Am I meeting Christ here? What is this about? So, embodiment, I would suggest, is the key to the effects of trauma on our spirituality. It's all about embodiment. It's not ethereal, nebulous stuff. It's here in the flesh. And Mary Gray, Catholic theologian, patron at Holy Rood, writes, embodiment is a metaphor for the activity and agency of God in the world. Those of us who work with ideas of theology and use terms like incarnation, the word became flesh, dwelt among us, that kind of embodiment, that is what Mary suggests, is that is God active in the world, through the body, through flesh. A theologian, Flora, I can never pronounce her name really, Keshgegian, I don't know if that's correct, any of you know her, but she's, some of her work is wonderful to read, and she writes about what does it mean to be a witness, and she uses the term, a witness is one that is with. If we're witnessing, say this woman coming through the doors at Holy Rood House, all scarred, I'm a witness. I'm not witnessing to her about Jesus. I am witnessing her as Christ to me. And my role as a witness is to be with, alongside, the with, God with us, Emmanuel, that kind of idea. And Flora picks all this up in her theology, worth you sort of Googling and finding that out. So what are the effects of trauma on our spirituality? Well, Leonard Shengold, a long time ago now, referred to abuse, sexual abuse of children as soul murder. Now I want to pick up the thing about body and soul, because I think we split it off too easily, but nevertheless, that little phrase, soul murder, and the stories I hear at the house, that is what it is. And of course, whenever we're a group here, statistically, you're talking about 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men. Soul murder. So what's happening to our spirituality? He writes, to abuse or neglect a child, to To deprive the child of his or her own identity and ability to experience joy in life is to commit soul murder. It's quite a sort of profound phrase, I think. And so what are the effects? Well, the loss of our creativity, the use of our senses, the loss of our libido, inability to feel, to notice, to be aware of the presence of others. People don't even notice other people. Not able to feel. Now, all of us have experienced trauma of different kinds. I'm sure all of us here have known, and even are with it at the moment, bereavement and pain of loss. It's part of being human. And there are times when we tumble from loss into loss into loss. It builds up till we get to a point where we come almost deadened, and we become numb to our feelings, and our creativity seems to disappear. Many a time someone will say to me, oh, I used to play the piano. I haven't played it for 2 years. I haven't touched it. Haven't even noticed it in the room. You know, or I used to do cross stitch. And you know, I haven't even picked it up. I don't even know where it is. You know, the loss of that, the thing that makes me me, seems to drop away. So the presence of others also, not only do we have the inability to notice the presence of others in trauma sometimes, but other times we're highly sensitized to it. And the presence of others can cause fear. The way a person walks in the room, where a person stands, how they stand, what they're wearing, all sorts of things. And the presence of others can be heightened. And the whole thing of symbols and language can become unsafe. In our main chapel at Holy Rood House, we don't have a cross. We don't have a usual, I can see a cross out there. I don't have a usual crucifix form. Well, we use the sort of Celtic cross, so it has the world around it. It's a more rounded cross. Because there have been times when we've had women who have been abused with the use of crosses. And to walk in and see one just flicks somebody back into their trauma. There have been times when we don't light any candles, for example, for same sort of reasons. So symbols and the language we use is very, very important. Trauma affects the whole way in which we feel and think and embody our spirituality. Space, the way people are in space, the way, one of the other things we do is, if I know someone, we've had somebody with us this week who's quite, I use the term wobbly really, so I make sure that when she has food with us to eat, she sits near me and the door is open by her side. She can go anytime she likes, she doesn't feel trapped. Very important, same in chapel. That a person doesn't feel trapped, the door needs to be open, the person needs to sit near the door. You have to think through these things because our spirituality is affected deeply, and it affects the space we're in and how we fill up space. And a person, I've often thought about the ideas of the ascension of Jesus. You know, one minute he's there and then he ascends and he disappears. It's almost like, I am with you, but I'm going. And we see this often with anorexia, mind you, cutting is taking over anorexia. Any of you who are teachers, ask any school, it's the cutting that's taking over and the competition in cutting rather than anorexia now. But with anorexia, often somebody's saying, look at me, I am not here, I'm disappearing. What I call the disappearing Christa. So space is important. Time disappears really. If we're with somebody living with trauma, it's really important just to gently say, you know, be dinner in a few minutes, sort of thing, because it's just not on the radar. Food is a difficulty, picking around with bits of food or not being able to taste food, and so on. Sleep is deprivation of sleep through flashbacks and so on and so forth. Dissociation, those skills that we all learn them. We all learn dissociative skills, but if somebody is abused, maybe as a child, in order to survive, that person will learn to dissociate. In order to survive, come above it. And those skills will carry on during life often. So we might find we just realise that that person's disappeared to another space. Now we all do it in our daydreaming and so on, and of course when we drive a car we sort of think, oh my goodness, I've got to Newark already. You know, and you realise there's been a space, a kind of dissociation. You've been a safe driver, but there's something happened there. Agitation, people not knowing what to do, agitated, needing to do something, so crafts, going in the garden, keeping an eye on that agitation because it can build up, and of course voices, flashbacks, recurring nightmares, all those things. Bodily pain. I was telling Chris that when we were under quite a lot of stress many years ago about some major things in our life, and at the same time we were setting up Holy Rood House, and I came for a conference here at St John's, and I slept down in the basement. Is this the basement? It could have been, you know, you were saying it's maybe below. I think it was the lowest of the lowest place. Very old student metal bed. And I was coping, but actually what happened was I laid in this bed and actually couldn't move. That was it. It all went to my back. I know it's quite a long story, but I found some healing here, which is interesting, just a little story. But it does. Trauma, stress, loss, grief. That was to do with grief for me. Where did it go? But in my back. Some people have migraines. So I've been working with a woman this week who is just having small headaches now, whereas before, when she first came to us, was having major migraines, really major, horrific migraines. And through her work with a therapist and the process of going through, working through the trauma and so on, that's just going now. Just occasional small headache, which just a couple of paracetamols and it's going. She's almost lost it now. Disability, of course, taking to bed, not being able to walk, and not being able to, just can't get the body to move. Quite apart from other disabilities because of abuse, because somebody's been so hurt that actually their legs are broken, and so on and so forth. And changes in the body because of breaking of boundaries by others. Then our boundaries go wrong, and our bodily space changes. And we see a lot of that. Whole thing of breakdown of trust, of course. Inability to love and to receive love, or to even know what love may be. So many people have actually never experienced love. We were saying, some of us the other day, that we had 2 people stay with us at Christmas who we felt, the community after us were talking about it, and we felt that these 2 people had never known love before. And so it's not easy for them to find it, to see it. They kind of know, they can't place it, they can't name it. And a community has to help them to hold it, because it is there for them. Self-harm, of course, mentioned cutting, all sorts of different self-harm, which is both a punishment, but also, of course, to release pain. Absolutely, to release the build-up of pain and the agitation to that. And at Holy Rood, we keep an eye on the agitation, very important, so that actually we can accompany people through that place. Anger to oneself, lots of anger to others, anger to God. You know, it's so important, isn't it, to be able to release anger, because it's often a pivotal point to change, actually. So how do we do that? We have to be in a safe enough place to be able to do that. Loss of voice. Actually, literally, I don't know whether there's any people here who speech therapists or anything, but speech therapists often are working with people who completely, they just cannot speak because they didn't speak when the abuse happened. They couldn't, they were silenced, either literally silenced or they were silenced because of the trauma, and they haven't spoken since. And that's what happens with children, of course, doesn't it, who have been in horrific situations abroad, say, as well as here, are in terrible situations, and they've seen horrific things and they don't speak. don't speak for years. So how are we heard into speech? Nellie Morton, a theologian who spoke about being heard into speech. We have to be heard in order for our voice to be found. And the inability to form sentences. I find that when I'm working with people that they're talking and then they can't, and they shift, and the sentence is kind of all muddled up. Loss of sense of self and being, and hate of self. Some quotes from guests, just a few quotes. I came in despair and anguish and utter pain. You held my story. We put on the abstract about storytelling. You held my story, placed me in a room of peace, offering me sanctuary and space to begin to find the healing I needed. Safe enough place to go to the unsafe places. So important in spirituality. It's really important. I discovered a gentle God, the love and acceptance needed in the care given to me. I discovered the awesome power of creativity to unlock our deepest recesses and the power of God to heal through the imaginative processes. I rediscovered myself and discovered for the first time parts of myself. It's a whole process to work through trauma deep on a spiritual level is an embodied process. And I was at the edge. Holy Rood House gave me time and space to step back from the edge. Working through spirituality, the effects of spirituality on spirituality of trauma takes time. It is a process, and often the trauma has been an ongoing process. Sometimes it's a sudden process, a sudden thing. Other times it's ongoing, year in, year out, and then you fall into another one, year in, year out. It takes a long while to work through. And this is interesting. Before I came to Holy Rood, I knew I was unlovable. So many people really believe they're totally unlovable. Many believe they are actually evil. Gradually, over several visits, I know that I am loved. To come to that point is very important. Come to the realisation that whether I'm here in the body or not, I'm still held by the love of Holy Rood. I'm part of a community of love. So all of us, whether it's in our families or our faith communities, if we have one, or other kinds of communities that we belong to, if we're a community of love, that will hold that person, whether they're literally there that day or not. I do believe that. I think that's very powerful. I'll just read this through quickly. Something else written by a guest. Pain, raw, horrific, leaving my body and soul, infecting my mind. Pain moulded into clay. We have a creative arts centre, so this person was using clay. Raw, horrific, graphic, dark images made real in the soft, forgiving clay. My life, my pain, there now, solid in clay, hard, unchanging, set for all time. Seasons change, winter to spring, summer to autumn, we too move and change in with the rhythm of life. The dark, cold winter of my life beckons the way for spring, for hope. The hard, unchanging images in the clay were broken and left to soak. With the same hands now she was reborn, reshaped, remade, with smooth flowing curves, with tenderness and compassion. She is my risen life, my broken body, my living soul. Now the person who actually wrote that some time ago said to me recently, these hands work with the clay, now break the bread. Because through all this, that person has come into vocation and now breaks the bread. And that's very powerful. So trauma and the effect on spirituality, working it through, this is an embodied thing. Here's these hands working through painful stuff and then is able to come through and break the bread for others. I think that's very powerful. So Embodied theologies are very important for us if we're going to look at the praxis of spirituality. And I used the term earlier about incarnation. It's a term that's used very much linked with the Gospel of John, the Word becoming flesh, dwelling among us. And the body knows, we're like a computer, aren't we? It's all in there. The body remembers. It's why something can, well, even those of you who have perhaps elderly relatives and that or working or supporting people with dementia, Alzheimer's, and we know that it's the short term, it's the long term memory. The body remembers stuff, and it needs to somehow remember and get stuff back together so it's reintegrated back into the body instead of all being fractured and in bits. Marina Warner wrote, "The body is still the map on which we mark our meanings." So if you take the scarring, our own scarring that you thought about, it has meaning on us. We wear it. It is on our skin. Carter Haywood, Episcopalian priest and theologian in America, bodies are the nature and destiny of God. So God isn't outside of it all. That is what the nature of God is, flesh. The Word became flesh, dwelt among us, and what I'm interested in really is how does the flesh begin to become the Word? How does the flesh speak out and become the Word? Body language, the way we hold our bodies, the way our bodies sort of become unbounded or disappear, whether we're curved in or how are we in our bodies? Our voice, can we find our voice? How does it become the Word within an embodied environment of mutual trust? Because when we find ourselves in that environment of mutual trust, mutuality, unspoken stories emerge. And as a priest myself, for me, the important thing is to make connections all the time between those stories and the Jesus story. It seems to me that there's that amazing connection, the human story and the Jesus story, particularly if we look at it in metaphorical ways. We are the body of Christ. These are terms, biblical terms. Our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. I mean, what could be more fleshed out about our spirituality there? So if our bodies have been traumatized, we're still the temple. So what does that mean then? Flesh, Lisa Isherwood, flesh becomes a place of revelation. Together we dare to risk our own divine incarnation. I think that's exciting. So how do we become divine? Many a time I'm sitting with somebody and saying, look, you don't want to worry about whether you are finding it difficult to believe in God. Somehow you are needing to become divine, or finding your own divineness through all this horror. That's what we're working with. And first of all, it's starting to believe in yourself that you can make that journey. And then it all emerges, and that's wonderful. So I'm suggesting that split theologies that split everything up, dualistic theologies, they lead to split spirituality and personalities, our many selves. We've all got many selves. We all wear different masks, we all have different roles and so on, but as we know, and it may be some of us here, we dissociate and become different selves in different situations if our trauma is touching us in a particular way. So I think we have to work really hard, or I try and work really hard, to break down theological dualisms, you know, all this stuff that doesn't help us to reintegrate everything. And so the language, church language, the language, those people who go to church, the language that is used in prayers and the hymns, in the readings, and the design of churches, the symbols that we see around us, almost completely they are dualistic. And I don't think that helps. I think it has a drip effect on us, preventing us from reintegrating and finding our becoming. There's the whole thing of language and symbol that denotes power and control, certainly in all faith communities. It's in our institutions. It's in me, it's in you. And those are things we have to work with in ourselves and put right and change. Environments and authoritarian systems goes with that really. The survival techniques that we've built up following trauma, all our splitness, the survival techniques like dissociating and so on, and splitting off and becoming multi-personality and so on, we do that to help us survive, but we have to move on past survival into becoming more whole. And therefore we have to work with that, and it's hard work, but it is possible to bring that back in ourselves. And I think one of the things that happens for many of us is that we have our own traumas, and we work with people or know people who've had major traumas, perhaps much more than we have, who are still giving themselves away to others. So I find myself working with, I work with women and men, but I often find myself working with women who have been majorly traumatised, but they have children. They are still giving themselves away to everybody else. Then they have ageing parents who may have abused them, and they still have to give themselves away because no one else is looking. You know, it just goes on and on. And if you haven't got any of yourself has been lost, and you're trying to give it away, you just become more emptied and emptied and emptied. And our spirituality is, well, thin. It's kind of, you can't get hold of it. One of our liturgies that we use when in the breaking of bread at a Eucharist, a communion service, we use the term, our breaking down becomes our breaking through. How do we transform our breaking down so it becomes our breaking through into transformation? We have to grieve, I think, in order for our spirituality to flourish. We have to grieve for the loss of ourselves. So it isn't the loss of that person who's died so much. It's the loss of me who's gone with that person because I looked after that person for 20 years. So I'm there. So we work a lot at Holy Rood House with the idea of the I am and the person. So for myself, I am Elizabeth, God Elizabeth. So if Elizabeth disappears, it's like the I ams disappear, and that comes back together, integrated together. I don't know whether you've ever said it. You will have heard people say it. I just don't know who I am anymore. Empty nest syndrome. There were so many women when children leave home. I just don't know who I am. Complete loss of self leads to depression. So the work towards reintegration. I want to just tell a little story about lilac blossom. Where are we on time?
Well, you're right.
All right at the moment. Right, okay. Embodied theology leads to a spiritual praxis. Story of lilac blossom. Some young people we were working with long term. One of these young women going for a walk around the garden, and out of the blue she pointed to a tree and said, "What's that?" Now this person had been in that garden, been living there for about 2 years, with major trauma. "What's that?" I said, "That's lilac blossom." And she said, "Well, I've never seen it before." So I said, "Well, why, if we just stand here for a minute, see if you can hear anything." So we stood, and she said, "There's a bird singing." Now, she'd been in that garden through all the seasons for a couple of years, but was unable to get in touch with these senses. And at last, working through the trauma, she spotted the lilac blossom. That's what happens. It's our senses become awakened. And what a joy it is. And then the hearing, and then the noticing of other things. Things begin to come back together. Life begins to emerge. Storytelling, listening, observing, all those things created that. I often use the term threshold theology. I think it's wonderful. The whole idea that theology has to always have something to do with thresholds, coming across, coming through, breaking through, stepping over, this kind of through theology, which I think the Jesus story is. Myself, I find that very profound. The Jesus story coming through from Good Friday to Easter Sunday, breaking through the tomb. All those kind of metaphors, I think, are very powerful. So how do we become, if we're having a spiritual praxis, a spiritual way of being, how do we become really present? Because trauma affects our presence, our very being. And Carter Haywood writes a lot about the power in relations. It's in relationship, that which goes between us, which is the presence, which I believe the divine is. That's what I believe the divine is, the movement between us and the earth and so on. So if we're able to have that power in relation, that affects our approach to the environment, the health of the planet, the seasons, all those things. We need to have an awareness of bodily changes. Very important, the ageing process. We've just had a weekend, this last weekend, for women 50 plus. How important, how essential. Complete change of life. Major decade, 50 to 60 in a woman's life, of changes, bodily changes, and that affects people's link with trauma, and it's often a time when people are willing to work with it, actually. And the body changes. Well, if our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, how does that affect that? What does that mean for our spirituality and so on? But that, men and women, boys and girls, all those movements. And I don't know whether any of you have read Brian Thorne, person-centred counsellor based at Norwich. He's a consultant with us, and a lot of what he's written is about the quality of tenderness. And he writes about that space between us, this relationship between us, the importance of tenderness, and if we have due attention with one another, which is really compassionate and really tender and really attentive, then there'll be a movement. That is what the divine movement is. And it's very profound, I think, very special. And important, and this is a big subject, all these are big subjects, I'm just throwing them out really for you to follow up if you want to rework ideas like kenosis, this thing of self-emptying, this kind of this theology that have been put on people, mainly women, but not entirely so, of completely having to give oneself away, submitting all the time, giving oneself away, not, selfishness is dreadful, guilt, all that stuff, to actually take kenosis, that kind of idea, differently and use it as a place of resistance. And Anna Mercedes writes about that. It's a very interesting thing to follow up. And Mary Gray writes about kenosis as the kenotic act that has to take place in order to really let go of things, in order that the planet may be safe. And that is something, a real challenge for people like myself, really. So kenosis in a way that is actually going to be active for the good, instead of creating guilt and fear and all those things. and a reworking, of course, of power, and even ideas of empowerment, to re-look at it, work with the power in the relation itself. The alertness to the senses. Tim Gorringe writes, the senses are instruments of grace, given us to know what grace means. And I think going back to the lilac blossom, this is what was happening for this young woman. She was touching in on grace. She'd had law bashed at her and used against her, pietistic stuff as an excuse for abuse and trauma. And she was touching grace. She saw the lilac blossom. And it's always grace, not law. Awakening to well-being, the I am, our divine becoming. And terms like coming home are things that I find that people find very helpful. And they will often say it themselves, I feel I'm coming home. It's a term that people kind of resonate with. I've put this here because I think it's very important. I don't know whether any of you have read anything of Nancy Island's work. It's back in the 90s. I'm not sure whether she's writing now. I expect she is. And she writes about, well, a wonderful book of hers, The Disabled, God it is. But so, discovering the disabled Christ, she writes, I saw God in a zip-puff wheelchair. Now, Nancy Island, paraplegic when she was born. So she'd always been, since she was sort of 2, in a wheelchair, as it were. I saw God in a zip-puff wheelchair, that is the chair used mostly by quadriplegics, enabling them to manoeuvre by blowing and sucking on a straw-like device. Not an omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither a pitiable, suffering servant. In this moment I beheld God as a survivor, unpitying and forthright. I recognised the incarnate Christ in the image of those judged not feasible, unemployable, with questionable quality of life. Here was God for me. Wonderful. Liberating. And Jackie Scully, who's profoundly deaf, Newcastle University, what contemporary body theology absolutely must not do is to ignore the equally valid experience of the body limited in time and space. These differences could be of theological and existential creativity, resources for everyone to draw on to understand what being embodied is all about. And that whole area, the vulnerable God or the disabled God, or these things are very important. Henri Nouwen, of course, many of us will know, writes about being wounded healers. Well, we're wounded healers, but who is the wounded healer? And who are we embodying? So our thought processes and our processes towards well-being are picked out, just a verse from the book of Philippians. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. So when we've been traumatised, or we know people living with trauma, and whole communities are traumatised, whole families, it is these things that we're trying to find. We're trying to bring them out. And they are found, and we're often astonished and moved, aren't we, when we on the television, a major trauma, and someone who's been in it will say something or have acted in a way which is all these things. It is there, but it's how we find it in ourselves despite everything. So a liberating spirituality, I think, is about our own, all that lovely stuff that's within us, our own innate wisdom, the presence of Sophia, wisdom, at the crossroads of our lives, those traumatic times, that she's there, embodied within us. And the I am sayings, I find the I am saying from John's Gospel, the way, I'm the way, the truth and the life, is wonderful because they're all verbs. Jesus saying, you know, this whole idea that I am actually the way you're walking, I am the process. I'm the truth you're discovering, you're finding your own truth. I am the life you're coming into. And so a grounded, embodied, sacramental approach to being people of grace and not law is key to our spirituality. So we make connections between all these things, and we reintegrate all the fractured parts of ourselves. So we've got all this stuff. So how do we make connections in order to bring it together? Well, part of that, I think, is the discovery of community. So a community of hospitality, that's the key. Safe space when life feels unsafe. But one of our first guests, a young man, he was probably about 19, he'd been in the army, he'd taken LSD with group. It was when, you know, it's a long time ago now, so LSD was around much more, I think, then. And he came and we spent some time together, and then we were just about to go and have a cup of tea, and he held on to me and he said, "Elizabeth, this is the first time I've felt safe enough to feel unsafe." And I've never forgotten that. That taught me more than anything else when we were setting Holy Rood House up. That's what he felt, and he could go to those unsafe places. And we need to be a community of conversation. That's a big subject. But an openness to hearing, receiving, learning, a conversation about all sorts of things, a remembering community where we remember, we put together the fractured stuff, but also remembering from the past, allowing ourselves to draw the good things from the past, to remember, to go to the future. Inclusive community, so hard to be an inclusive community. I could talk about that, but we know it's really important to be inclusive. How do we do that? How do we work it out in practice? That's something that all communities have to look at and take seriously. Becoming a community of mutuality. So, where's authority there? Some people find mutuality very difficult to cope with, because they'd rather have somebody telling them what to do, how to work, where to be. But actually, no, how do we draw from each other and learn and be mutual together? Community of storytelling, a community of faith. I put a little quote there from one of our guests. "Thank you for believing in me when I could no longer believe in myself." Really important. I was saying to Chris earlier, I had a supervisor who really believed in me, and that's why I did some work. If she hadn't have done, I wouldn't have done. But she kept me there because she believed in me when I didn't actually believe in myself for it. Threshold community. Always, where are the thresholds? What are people stepping over, coming through? What are they finding when they do? A visionary community. What is the vision of the community? How do we keep to that? That must happen here for, you know, the university in St John's even. What's the vision? How do we stick to it? Becoming a prophetic community. Where does the voice go? What are we saying for the world? 2 quotes now, and then we'll finish and we'll hopefully have some interesting discussion. This is Carter Haywood, the priest and theologian from America. If we burn with a passion for well-being, the spark for burning is God. In sustaining and becoming ourselves in relation, we are giving birth to more of this sacred power who needs us, her friends, to bring her to life and help nourish her life on the earth. She is being born among us. She is not yet, but becoming. That's really is what happens, actually, I find, in working with people living with trauma in a safe or safe as possible community. And then one of our guests who picks up the idea of the spark, I'll read it through. There's a picture of Holy Rood up there and Thorpe House. Wound tight. We have little books in the bedrooms and people write in them, so these are just from the bedroom books. Wound tight by the pressures and prejudices of those who believe in a rule book instead of good news, I ran to a half-remembered bolt hole to reconnect with those whose faith means that God is known in splashing paint and quiet labyrinth, in mixtures and margins, in steaming hot chocolate and broken bread and poured wine. And the coil unwound a little, and my breathing slowed a little, and I laughed a little easier. and I go more slowly as I leave, because I would stay longer in this place where holy wholeness lies, in the true freedom of being loved as we are. If you are here too, she's writing the book for the next person, it's rather lovely. If you are here too for such solace, may it find you, and may you find it in you to walk taller as you leave, taking your space, accepting your face, making your place a glimmering spark of God's kingdom. I think that's a lovely way of seeing how all those things together, the creativity, the exploration, the food, the time, the space, broken bread, poured wine, all those things together create this glimmering spark of God's kingdom. I could talk for a month without stopping because I feel very passionate about the work that we are privileged to share in. But this is your space to come and explore and talk about ideas and thoughts and questions, comments, things that will help us with our work when we go back tonight and so on. So thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.